Okay, so get this. Today we're doing a deep dive into chip war.
Yeah, this one's a wild ride through, well, the history of basically everything. I mean, we're talking about semiconductors, geopolitics, global economics.
All because of tiny little chips. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around.
Right. Like, who knew something so small could be so important?
Seriously. And speaking of mind-blowing, did you know that those chips in your phone, the really advanced ones, odds are they were made in a single building in Taiwan?
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Mhm.
TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, they're Fab 18. It's like the most important building you've never heard of.
Fab 18, what is that, like chip headquarters or something?
Basically, it's where they make the most advanced chips in the world. And the book says it's just a few dozen miles from where the U.S. Navy has ships patrolling. Talk about high stakes.
Whoa, okay, back up. So we've got this one facility pumping out these tiny chips. I mean, the book says they're smaller than a virus.
It's insane, the scale of it all. And the fact that the entire world is basically holding its breath, hoping nothing happens to that one building.
Especially since, Taiwan's kind of known for earthquakes.
Right. The book talks about that the whole fragility of the system, one earthquake, one typhoon, and suddenly no more smartphones, laptops, cars.
Even fighter jets?
Exactly. It really makes you think twice about tossing out that old earthquake kit, huh?
No kidding. Okay, but here's what I don't get. The book says Silicon Valley. Well, it wasn't always the king of chips. How is that even possible?
Yeah, it's a common misconception. You think Silicon Valley, you think chips. Right. But in the early days, it was all about government contracts
Mm.
and the space race.
Wait, what? Are you telling me my smartphone owes its existence to a bunch of rocket scientists?
In a way, yeah. The book has all these excerpts about Fairchild Semiconductor, one of the pioneers of Silicon Valley. Bob Noyce, their co-founder, said over 95% of their business was from military and space programs at one point.
So the Cold War was basically funding microchips.
Pretty much. It just goes to show government support, especially in the early stages of a technology, it can have a huge impact.
It's like this secret history of technology that nobody talks about.
I know. And it's not just about the money either. The book talks about the Apollo guidance computer, right?
Yeah,
They needed something incredibly small and powerful to fit in the spacecraft.
makes sense.
So that push for miniaturization back in the 60s, it had this ripple effect on the entire industry.
It's wild how much those early space programs shaped the technology we have today. But we were talking about Japan. They were big in the chip game too,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Huge. But they had a slightly different focus. Less about raw computing power for, missiles and stuff, and more about consumer electronics.
Consumer electronics, so like Walkmans.
Exactly. The Sony Walkman, that's a perfect example. Chips made it possible to shrink down all that technology, create a whole new way to listen to music.
It's true. I remember those things were huge EE back in the day, hundreds of millions sold. Crazy to think about those little chips driving that kind of cultural phenomenon.
It's wild, right? And it shows how chips weren't just about, like, geopolitical chess. They were shaping culture, everyday life. But, and this is a big but, as chips became more and more everywhere, they also became, well, kind of like the oil of the digital age.
Hold on. Oil. What do you mean?
Like, essential. Totally crucial. The book calls them the crude oil of the 1980s. And it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Oil fueled the Industrial Revolution. Chips. They're fueling the information revolution.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So it wasn't enough to just have cool gadgets anymore. You needed to be able to make the chips too, or else what? You're at the mercy of whoever can.
Bingo. And this is where the Cold War gets really serious on the tech front. The U.S. military, they're relying more and more on advanced weapon systems, right? Guided missiles, smart bombs,
Yeah.
all that stuff needs serious chip power.
So now I'm picturing generals in a war room somewhere demanding smaller and faster chips. It's like a whole other arms race, but with silicon.
Exactly. And the book talks about this guy, Andrew Marshall, a strategist who was obsessed with making sure the U.S. stayed ahead of the Soviet Union in tech.
Mm.
He saw chips as the key to that. Push for massive investments in research and development.
Wow. So all this time while we were rocking out to our Walkmans and playing the latest video games, there was this whole other level to it, a fight for control of the future of, well, everything, I guess.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just about the U.S. and the Soviets anymore. Because here's the thing. Making chips, it was getting seriously complicated. We're not just talking about individual companies anymore, even countries. You need a whole global network. Specialized companies all over the place to make it happen.
Huh. So like a global assembly line for chips, what happens when one part of that line breaks down?
Exactly. It gets interesting. And that brings us to ASML. They're a Dutch company, and they make this machine. It's called an EUV lithography machine. And it's basically the key to making the most advanced chips in the world.
EUV. Okay, I'm going to need a little help with that one.
Right, sorry. So lithography, that's how they create the tiny patterns on silicon wafers. Those patterns become transistors, which are the building blocks of chips. And EUV, that stands for extreme ultraviolet. It's the type of light they use in these machines. Basically, the shorter the wavelength of light, the smaller and more precise you can make the patterns, which means more powerful chips.
So ASML, they're kind of calling the shots then, if they're the only ones with the EUV tech.
They have a lot of power, that's for sure. They've basically cornered the market on EUV lithography. But here's the catch. Even ASML can't do it alone. Those machines, hundreds of companies all over the world contribute parts, expertise, you name it. It's like peak globalization, you know?
Okay, but also peak vulnerability. Because if one country, one company controls a key part of that global supply chain.
They've got leverage, lots of it.
Yeah.
And that brings us to China, because they've been working really hard to build what they call a red supply chain, investing tons of resources trying to build up their own domestic chip industry.
Trying to cut up the middleman, basically. Less reliance on companies like ASML, less reliance on, well, the U.S., I guess.
Exactly, and that's why it's called chip war, right? We've gone from chips powering Walkmans to this, a global power struggle with everything at stake.
I mean, talk about pressure. Imagine being TSMC right in the middle of all that. What are they even supposed to do?
Right, it's a no-win situation, almost. The U.S. wants them to, cut off China. But
Yeah.
China's a huge market. It's complicated.
Yeah, understatement of the century. It's like you can't talk about chips without talking about global politics anymore.
Exactly. The book talks about how China sees AI as the key to, well, dominating the 21st century, economically, militarily, and they know chips are essential to that.
And they're not afraid to throw their weight around to get what they need.
Which is why this whole thing is about so much more than just, faster phones or whatever. It's about who gets to control the future of, well, everything, really. The future of computing, AI.
It's kind of scary, honestly. The stakes are so high.
It is a bit, yeah. Like the book
Yeah.
really makes you realize this isn't just about technology. It's about values. Open markets versus, well, more closed systems.
Yeah.
Democracy versus...
Yeah. And it feels like the whole world woke up to this, like overnight. I mean, remember a few years ago,
Yeah.
nobody was talking about chips. Then the pandemic hit. Suddenly there's this global shortage.
Right. Empty shelves, delayed car deliveries.
Yeah.
It suddenly became very real for people.
And then you've got governments getting involved, talking about reshoring chip manufacturing like it's some national security issue.
Which it is. It's
Yeah.
a huge deal. And not just for the U.S. We're talking global competition now.
Yeah.
Countries all over throwing money at the problem, trying to, become the next chip superpower.
So where does that leave us? I mean, for folks like me who aren't, chip engineers or political strategists, what are we supposed to take away from all this?
Honestly, I think the biggest takeaway is don't take anything for granted. That phone in your pocket, it exists because of this whole crazy, complex global system. Geopolitics, economics, history, it's all connected.
So pay attention. Read books like Chip War. Educate yourself because this stuff, it's not going away.
Absolutely. The future's going to be wild.
No doubt about it. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive on Chip War. Thanks for joining us.